It's the All of the Above Energy Podcast, part 2 of my conversation with Chad Warmington. In this episode, the former chief of staff to 3 Oklahoma House speakers talks about the state's insane budgeting process and why the oil game is a finance game now, not the old Wildcatters game.
You're listening to the new media. You're listening to Mitchell Talks. Learn more at MitchellTalks.com and follow me, Scott Mitchell, on Twitter at Mitchell Talks.
You know, what's interesting, the governor gave us a great statistic. We had a visit with him last week. He said we have a $613 million surplus being projected by Board of Equalization. We know that number's not true, probably going to be in the low 4s. He said, but here's what's crazy. State agencies have asked for $3 billion in increased expenditures. And he just can't get his head around that. He was sitting at a table going, I don't even understand how that doesn't compute to the real world, which was also a pivot for his argument that he said, you give me control of those big 5 state agencies, they're not walking in here and asking for $3 billion of new revenue, knowing that at most we're going to have $400 million. They're not going to do that. They're going to come in and make the business case of either why they need more money or they're going to come in and say we need less. And I think that's what Oklahomans ought to really be thinking about when the legislature right now is kind of balking at giving him that control, is those are the kind of fiscal controls that he'll put in place. He won't have agency directors coming in and asking for $3 billion of new revenue in 1 year without any sort of justification for why they're going to do it. I think it's a strong case for giving him that power and letting the buck stop with him and the accountability end at his desk. If you don't like what they're doing, you got somebody accountable, the governor of Oklahoma. If he doesn't fix it, toss him out, and that's what he's saying. GPD is only 20% of the total revenue the oil and gas industry throws off. So there's another full 80% of revenue that's derived from other sources than gross production tax. And that's what I was trying to get the industry or the legislature to understand. Rigs running is what really drives our economy. That's when you get tons of capital investment, sales tax, payroll tax, ad valorem dollars when rigs are in Oklahoma. Gross production is the tail end of the revenue. It's after the wells have been drilled, the employees have been paid, and the proceeds now are being generated from the actual production. But that's the end of the cycle. And it's only 20% of the total revenue that this industry generates when it's active. Rig count is what legislators need to be focused on because that's the economic engine that drives the state. So, pivoting, talking back about, Secretary Teague's comments, and I really appreciate them, and I appreciate his understanding of and confirmation of what a great relationship we had with the Secretary of Energy and what a great relationship we have with the state's regulatory bodies. So what we need is regulatory certainty and stability and tax certainty and stability. If you put those two things in place, and so that our members, when they're making their capital allocation decisions, and typically in November, December of every year, that they go, okay, we can bank on Oklahoma because we know that the regulatory environment's not going to change and the tax environment's not going to change. Now we can make decisions, financial decisions, based on that. Now you can't predict commodity prices, but they hedge their production and they offset that risk in other ways. What they couldn't offset the risk was, well, what's Oklahoma going to do to us this year? So if you're a company that Valerie Mitchell, who's one of our members, it runs, all of her assets are in Oklahoma. That was a huge tax increase her business just got last year. She's not like, a Continental who's got North Dakota assets or a Marathon who's got Permian assets and Texas assets where they could offset that tax increase. Valerie's a great example of a company that just got whacked for a pretty significant cost increase. So in November, when she was making her capital allocation decisions, she didn't factor in, a 3% increase in gross production tax, which is a pretty significant increase when you've got private equity people that are looking at every dollar you're spending going, why are we not making more money in Oklahoma? And she's having to defend that. So stability and consistency are what we need. And I think Governor Stitt definitely understands that and is going to be a big promoter of that. It's interesting, and I'm glad you brought that up. I've had 2 conversations with really two different types of oil and gas companies. One is a great member out of Oklahoma City who runs a company called Red Bluff, and he's the CEO, Tim Haddocken, and he was saying, Chad, I've been in the business a long time, and I never anticipated how difficult it was going to be when it pivoted toward a economic return model. It isn't about finding reserves and proving them up and getting rigs running and huge production numbers. It's about how much money are you making. And so he said, I spent all my time trying to figure out how we're going to cut costs and get a better rate of return to make his private equity partners, the people who lent him the money, permit him to continue to put dollars to work in Oklahoma. It isn't about production. It's about rate of return. They don't care where that well is, and they don't really care how much it produces. All they care about is what's the rate of return. And so it's really interesting. You've gotten the wildcatter, the oil men out of the game, and now it's run by finance people. And that's just on the private equity side. It's even worse on the publicly traded side. Go look at Devon Energy or Newfield or Marathon or Continental, any of these companies who have large institutional investors, and they're all over them too. Devon has been cutting costs for years, and it's still not enough for their analysts. And so the game has changed. It's really driven by finance people in Houston and New York and frankly around the world that invest in our companies. And so we can't just go play with taxes and regulatory costs and think that doesn't going to impact drilling decisions, because it will. We got another member named Daryl Noblet, who's based out of Tulsa. He's a private equity backed guy. He wants desperately, he's got about $250 million of private equity to invest in oil and gas wells because his investors believe he knows how to make money in the oil and gas business. He can't put a single dollar of it to work in Oklahoma right now because he can't justify the rate of return. So he's drilling all his wells in Texas. And Daryl tells me all the time, man, I want to be here. I want to put that money to work here. I can't justify it right now. So those are the kind of stories and the understanding of how these allocation decisions are getting made that we need our legislature to understand. Our governor gets it. We need the legislature to understand it. And I'm not advocating we go in and cut our taxes. What I'm saying is peace and quiet, stability, leave us alone, demonstrate to Houston and New York and all these places that Oklahoma's not going to come after our oil and gas industry and that our rates of return aren't going to change based on our decisions. Commodity prices, that's out of our control. But when the state all of a sudden is whacking you for $600 million over 2 years, that's a lot of money that didn't go to bottom lines of those investors, and they are not going to be too excited about putting that money back to work in Oklahoma. It's a finance guy's game. It's not an oil and gas man's game anymore. It's finance model.
Part 3 coming up soon. You're listening to All the Above Energy podcasts, brought to you by the Mitchell Talks Network.
You're listening to the new media, the Mitchell Talks Network. Learn more at MitchellTalks.com and follow me, Scott Mitchell, on Twitter @MitchellTalks.